日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and yeah, it's been a while, but I was digging through some files the other day, and I actually stumbled on something that I thought you guys would find pretty interesting. Back in about 2014 or so, or sometime between 2012 and 2014, you might remember that Forrest and I kind of did a collection of bonus episodes for the podcast, sort of different themed podcast episodes. We actually had one more on Sengoku Daimyo, which we never actually released because actually we kind of felt like, well, there were two things. One, the battery died, so we couldn't finish it. But the second part of it actually is that it kind of turned out to be more of a lecture, and we didn't really like the way we really didn't want a lecture. We actually wanted more of a conversation, but that's just kind of how it came out for whatever reason. So we had intended to go through and actually re-record it as more of a discussion with talking points and bullet points and that kind of thing, but we actually didn't get there. And it actually languished on my computer for, what's that, 7 years, give or take? So yeah, 7 years ago we recorded this podcast and it's just getting released now. So it's not complete because it does cut out because the battery died, but there is a lot of good information. It does go into a lot of detail on the Sengoku Daimyo. And another thing that I decided to do is, normally I edit the hell out of these things. Actually, all of them. I do a massive amount of editing. But actually, in this case, I decided to leave a lot of the stuff that I would have cut out. I decided to leave it in. I kind of wanted to give it like that behind... What do they call that? Behind baseball? Inside baseball, that's it. An inside baseball type feel. So you can kind of see, how things kind of go generally when we're recording a podcast. I cut out a lot of extraneous stuff, but the stuff that was kind of, involved in what we were doing actually stayed in. So yeah, don't get kind of annoyed that there's like us kind of like talking about what we're going to do or, trying to figure out which direction we're going to go with the podcast. I actually left that in there intentionally. And like I said, normally I'd take that out, but I thought that since this is a throwback episode from like 7 years ago, it might be interesting to kind of leave some of that stuff in. So anyway, here's the episode, but before you listen, or after, either way, if you are willing to support the podcast, please head over to patreon.com/samuraiarchives and take a look at how you can help us out. There is a lot of bonus content over there, so if you are interested in pretty frequent bonus content, I try to get something up, pretty substantial bonus content up every month or two. Sometimes I'm a little lax there, but usually I'm pretty good about it. So I do have a lot of access to a lot of interesting things that I've been putting in there. So if that interests you, please head over to patreon.com/samuraiarchives. All right, and let's get started.
Introducing from Honolulu, Hawaii, Christopher Wester and Forrest
Okay, we're going to talk today. This is fascinating stuff. Everybody's going to be at the edge of their seats. We're going to talk a little bit about today the Sengoku Daimyo, who they were, why they were, who they were, the sort of things they did, and what became of them. This isn't going to be a particularly in-depth, super uber scholarly discussion. I just want to hit on some major points for anybody who may be interested in this subject. And we're going to talk a little bit about who they were, a little bit about when they existed,
what they did, who they were, why they, or the various types of daimyo, how various people became daimyo, various things about them, the issues of inheritance, how they made their money, how they taxed their citizens, etc., etc.
Yes, and their favorite colors. We'll talk about that.
And their blood type, that's very important in Japanese
blood type, culture. Yeah, if it's known. What their blood type was. Online gaming preferences. Really the whole bag. So let's see here. I guess if we're going to talk about the Sengoku Daimyo, the first thing we should probably hit on is what were, or rather who were the Sengoku Daimyo. Well, if we're going to talk about who were the Sengoku Daimyo, well, that's of course a compound descriptor, Sengoku and Daimyo, and both of them kind of require a moment's discussion. What was the Sengoku? Well, the Sengoku era is usually translated a couple of different ways into English. It's the age of the country at war, the warring states period of Japan.
The literal, if you look at the kanji, it's war country. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, the age of the country at war.
Yeah.
So, now, it always sucks to start out.
Yeah, well, I guess first part, types of daimyo, so you have the Shugo Daimyo, the Shugodai, the usurpers,
Well, I mean, as far as, let's hold on. Oh god, I ran through all this shit in my head earlier.
Do we have to, are you looking at like defining Sengoku Daimyo? Or?
Yeah. So what was a Sengoku Daimyo? A Sengoku Daimyo, in general terms, was a independent warlord, what we would call a warlord. He paid lip service to the incumbent shogun and to the emperor, but for all intents and purposes he was an independent power unto himself. He answered to nobody but himself, at least in theory. He was the top of a pyramid, a feudal pyramid. He was nobody's retainer. So that was during the 16th century in Japan. That would be a Sengoku Daimyo. I don't have enough beer in me. I gotta drink some more of this beer.
I thought you wanted to do a sober podcast.
What was I thinking?
What the hell were you thinking?
Oh my god, I'm steadily losing my mind.
You need another black beer stout. That'll fix you up.
Yeah, it's like, I can't get through. It's like a commercial for Bud Light and for beer. It's like, I'm trying to do this podcast, but I can't get it done.
Or you're sitting in, some dude sitting in a cubicle. I've got 6 more hours to go. I just can't do it.
What? And then his buddy reaches over the cubicle. I know what you need, mate.
A Bud Light.
Bud Light.
Froggies.
And he's like,
I'm ready to work now.
hell yeah, I can get this done. Now, Japan for about 100 years was a patchwork of daimyo domains. Now, a daimyo was essentially an independent warlord, an independent ruler of a certain amount of territory. And apart from paying lip service in varying degrees to whomever occupied the Ashikaga shogunate at that time, or the emperor, the court, he didn't answer to anybody. Now, it's just like as I'm going through, I'm like jettisoning some of my ideas already. Like, I don't want to talk too much about the Sengoku period itself. So I guess the first thing we should probably do is discuss the various types of daimyo.
Let's do that.
That sounds like a capital idea. Now, by type of daimyo, what's meant there is the origins of the daimyo houses. Now, the daimyo of the 16th century, and again, we're talking about 100-year span of time here. The daimyo houses of the 16th century had varied origins. Some of them had been powerful lords prior to this period of disorder in Japan, others had been virtual unknowns, and some were sort of in between. Now, we would say the established lords were the Shugo. Now, the Shugo were provincial governors who were named by the shogunate to their position. And typically, Shugo controlled multiple provinces. You had massive Shugo like the Wasigi, the Harakiyama, the Yamana, the Akamatsu, who ruled numerous provinces. Now, under them, you had their lieutenants, the Shugodai, who actually concerned themselves with and we talked about this in previous podcasts, but it bears retelling here. The Shugodai concerned themselves with the actual day-to-day running of these individual provinces, while the Shugo pressed their own concerns in Kyoto. Now, Kyoto, for most of the Muromachi period, which was the era preceding and leading into the Sengoku era in which the Ashikaga were the shoguns, as distinct from the Kamakura period in which the Minamoto, followed by their regents, the Hojo, ruled Japan from Kamakura. With the fall of the Hojo, Shiken, the regency, the center of power had moved to Kyoto. And the palace, because that's what it was. The shogun's palace, right, in Kyoto was the Muromachi Palace. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, just making sure. Don't want to be called out. Okay, so rewinding slightly. Following the destruction of the Hojo regency by the Ashikaga, the center of power shifted from the east to the central, or so-called home provinces surrounding Kyoto, and to Kyoto itself. And the Ashikaga were established at the Muromachi residence, and thus their era is known as the Muromachi period. Now, during the Muromachi period, various clans were assigned as Shugos. Some of these were newly minted by the Ashikaga. Some of them were pre-existing powers, such as the Takeda, who had their rule reinforced and legitimized by the Ashikaga. But some of these Shugo, and these Shugo who survived into the Sengoku period, included the Imagawa of Suruga province, the Sadake of Hitachi province, the Takeda, famous Takeda, of Kai province, but also branch families, cadet families existed in Wakasa province and in Aki province, the Shimizu of Satsuma province in Kyushu, the Oichi of western Honshu, the Rokaku of Omi province, the Ogasawara of Shinano province, the Yamana, the Harakiyama, the Otomo, Hasakawa, the Tso of Tsushima Island, or Su Island, I guess you could say, the Kawano of Iyo province, and the Akamatsu, just to name a few. Now, of these, a number of them survived into the Sengoku era, segmented into separate and essentially independent branches. Some examples of that would include the Harakiyama, who had branches established as daimyo in Ki province in the center, Noto province in the Tohaku region, and Mutsu, I believe, in far northern Japan. And of course, as mentioned, the Takeda family, who had 3 separate branches at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, as mentioned, the actual running of provinces was typically left to the Shugodai and their lieutenants. It's interesting to note, as an aside, that those clans who those Shugo, I should say, who only controlled one province, or their traditional provinces. A good example being the Takeda and the Shimazu. Takeda, Shimazu, Oichi. Those Shugo who occupied a relatively contiguous traditional base of power, for example, the Takeda and Kai province, the Shimazu and Satsuma, the Oichi and Nagato and Suo, the Rokaku and Omi province, tended to fare better in the 16th century than those Shugo whose power base, those larger Shugo whose power base was spread out across non-contiguous parts of Japan. Again, the Shiba, the Harakeyama, the Yamana, the Uesugi. But to return to the Shugodai daimyo of the 16th century, the notable Shugodai daimyo of the 16th century included the Oda family, who had served the Shiba in Owari province, and continued, in fact, to pay them nominal lip service right up until the time of Nobunaga. The Asakura, who also served the Shiba in Echizen province, and again, there's an example of the Shiba of having prior to the Sengoku area, having a non-contiguous domain. Echizen in the Tohaku area, Owari to the south of that, separated by Mino province. In the end, they ended up losing both of them. The Miyoshi family of Setsu and Eastern Shikoku, they had served the Hasakawa and come to some preeminence under the Hasakawa, and ultimately became independent of them. And then a Gao family of Echigo, who would eventually spawn the famous Uesugi Kenshin. They were lieutenants for the Uesugi family, the much larger Uesugi family that at one point in time ruled most of northern central Japan. They ruled all of the Kanto and Echigo and so forth. The Amako family, who were the lieutenants of the Kyogoku in Izumo province. Now, in addition to the Shugo daimyo and the Shugodai daimyo, you have what you could call the Jito daimyo. Now, the Jito were court-appointed stewards of provincial manors and court and bakufu possessions in the province, in the provinces. And some famous examples of those include the Chozokabe of Tosa province on Shikoku, the Mori family of Aki province. Now, you have a class that you could describe as being usurpers almost. Now, these guys were established retainer families of given Shugos or Shugodai, who in the course of the 16th century, or rather typically the early 16th century, ended up overtaking their nominal overlords. Some well-known examples of those include the Asai family of Omi. They served like the Amako, they served the Kyogoku. The Raizoji of Hizen province, they had been retainers of the Shoni. And there are a couple of good examples. Now, moreover, you also had a number of daimyo families that sprang from court or bakufu appointed officials, kokushi, or nobles, kuge. Respectively, the examples in this case would be the Kiripatake of Ise province and the Ichijo of Tosa province. Moreover, there were a number of Ashikaga branch families who became daimyo as well, including a rather short-lived one in Izu that ended up being overthrown by the famous Hojo Suan, and in Shimosa, the area around Shimosa province, the so-called Kanto Kubo, or Koga Kubo. Kubo, take your choice. And then finally we come to those who don't really fit into any of those categories, and they were true self-made
Sort of
daimyo.
the opportunists.
Yeah, the opportunists, the true opportunists. Most famously, you had the Saito of Mino Province, Saito Dosan, who eclipsed the Toki family, and the so-called Go Hojo, the later Hojo family, that ultimately came to control most of the Kanto.
And Hojo Son himself is sort of seen as, or arguably is the first Sengoku Daimyo,
Yeah, the epitome of the concept of Gekkokujo.
which is the low overthrowing the high.
Right, which and now in the case of both Saito Dosan and Go Hojo, and really you could add Matsunaga Hizahide to that list.
Right.
I mean, he very little is known about his origins. It's known that he had been a friend of Miyoshi Chokai from an early age, and based on that connection, rose high up, and ultimately became an essentially independent daimyo in Yamato Province. Now, what typifies these guys, these usurpers, the Gekkokujo daimyo, is that we don't know a whole lot about their early lives. We don't really know where they came from. There's always various theories. And they weren't, but all we know for sure is they weren't part of an established order. They were the low, whereas the high were those guys who had in the case of the Hojo, I guess you would say it was the Wesigi and the Miura, who controlled Sagami Province, Musashi Province, and so forth. In the case of the Saito, it would be the Toki, the Shugo of Mino Province. These were the high. They were part of that established order. So these guys came along and unseated them. So that would be the low overthrowing the high. So now we've talked a little bit about the types of Sengoku Daimyo. So we talked a little bit about the types of Sengoku Daimyo. Now it may be useful here to remember that there were a lot of daimyo. By at least one count, at the height of the Sengoku era, there was something like 250 daimyo, men who could be described as being daimyo. Not by the later Edo period standard of 10,000 koku, but just they were more or less powers unto themselves. So while there were many types of daimyo, there were also many degrees of daimyo. Some daimyo controlled a few districts. Oda Nobunaga, we talked about in an earlier podcast, he was a daimyo, quote unquote, but he only controlled 3 or 4 districts of Owari Province. Contrast that with the Oichi daimyo, who at that time controlled the better part of 3 or 4 provinces and had influence over at least as many, or parts of at least as many. So there was no particular, during the Sengoku era, there was no particular qualification in terms of land or castles or provinces to be a daimyo. You basically just had to answer to nobody but yourself, and you could call yourself a daimyo. Now, it's a pretty big subject, so let's just start with inheritance issues. Does that seem like a plan?
That sounds about right.
Alrighty.
That's where all of the conflicts always start in a daimyo family.
Right. And was the issues of inheritance amongst the Shugo were actually a major catalyst for the changes that brought about the Sengoku era. So it actually bears a bit of discussion. Now, something that isn't that well known is that once upon a time in Japan, most powerful landowning families had what we in the West would consider gavelkind type succession, which meant that upon the death of the head of the household, his possessions were divided up amongst his surviving children, be they male or female. Now, this carries a certain, if you're a powerful family, this carries a certain amount of good and a certain amount of bad. It's good because generally everybody's more or less content with the result. If it's divided up equally, if you have 3 sons, one son becomes the head of the existing family, and then another chunk of land is given to your second son, who then takes his own name and starts his own subsidiary family, and the same goes with the third. The first son is still in charge, but the other sons have their own little bit and their own little families, so really everybody's kind of happy. The downside is that over time you begin to whittle away the power and influence of the main branch of the family. You create a lot of little subsidiary houses, but at every generation you're whittling away and you're whittling away a little bit. But this held up through the Kamakura period. Now, going into the Muromachi period, it began to change to what we would call primogeniture, inheritance, whereby the eldest son of the existing lord would inherit everything. That itself brought good and bad. The good thing was that the power, influence, and land of your family wasn't dissipated upon your death, and it would continue from generation to generation. The bad part was you're putting all your eggs in that one basket and one guy gets it. People being people, that's not always going to go over well. And starting really in the 15th century, as these families got bigger and bigger, and particularly the Shugo houses got bigger and bigger, you start to see massive inheritance disputes breaking out among some of the most important Shugo houses. The Ogasawara, the Harakeyama, the Togashi, the Shiba, all of them were racked with inheritance disputes. Now, pausing here, going back to the old way of inheritance, the Gavelkind inheritance, this kind of explains why, fast forwarding to the 16th century, you see a lot of families, retainer families, that are related to the main house. Take, for example, the Takeda family. A lot of their retainer houses, their traditional retainer houses, the Yanayama, the Akiyama, etc., were related to them. Well, that was because back in the day, go back enough centuries, when one of the Takeda died, one of his sons went off to some place called Aniyama, settled down there, took that name, and under that system, although they got to have their own family and their own clan, they were still considered to be subsidiaries of the main family, in that case the Takeda. But so centuries later, they're still retainers with these familial ties to the main house, cadet houses of the main house. And again, another example that pops to mind would be the Niro family, who were powerful retainers of the Shimazu on Satsuma province. But so, you start to see these massive inheritance disputes going on amongst the Shugo. And this really kind of begins to set up the overall destablement of the realm that ultimately culminates in the Onin War, which from the Onin War flows the Sengoku period of which we speak. And I think a pretty strong argument could be made that the significance of the Onin War was that the Onin War did not break the central authority, in this case the Ashikaga. That was tenuous to begin with. The Ashikaga authority, shogunate's authority, had ebbed and flowed based on the force of will of whoever happened to be occupying the office. What the Onin War, I think, really signified was the breaking of the authority of the Shugo families. Because between the inheritance disputes, like a good example would be the Ogasawara. The Ogasawara were the Shugo of Shinano province. I think around 1442, sometime around there, the head of that family died, and his son was named the successor. However, he had a nephew who claimed that his father was more senior in the line and he should be the new Shugo. And the family broke into two branches, lining up against one side or the other. And even long before the Sengoku era even began, the Ogasawara were weakened. But in any event, going into the Sengoku era, the daimyo houses were still governed primarily by primogeniture, but not entirely. Now, by that I mean that the guy who took over the family, the head, the guy who succeeded the daimyo, was still the eldest son. Usually, but there were certain rules of thumb. Generally, it was the eldest son of the legal wife of the daimyo. Because remember, a daimyo could have his legal wife. You had one wife. That was your legal wife. Under that, you had consorts. And you might have a number of consorts. And a consort was like kind of a wife. It was enough like a wife to where you could give your daughter to someone as a consort, and that was kind of a useful political tool. She wasn't the wife, but it was almost like a marriage alliance. And under that you had concubines, and concubines were almost like they're gumas, basically. You could have any number of concubines, basically, and their background could be almost anything. I mean, there were some daimyo who had commoner concubines, so forth and so on. Now, basically, your place in the succession was based on the status held by your mother. The first priority was to the legal wife's sons. The second would be to the consort's sons. Concubine sons were basically considered bastards. Now, a good example of that would be the case of Oda Nobunaga. He was technically the second son of his father, Oda Nobuhide. However, his elder brother Nobuhiro was the son of a consort of Oda Nobuhide, while Nobunaga was the eldest son of Nobuhide's legal wife. So that when Nobuhide died, that was the foundation of Nobunaga's claim on the inheritance, and it, for the most part, wasn't disputed at the time. It would be disputed later, but for other reasons. Nobunaga provides kind of another interesting example in the form of his two sons, Nobuo and Nobutaka, who were born at about the same time. But even though Nobutaka was born a little bit earlier than Nobuo, he was considered the third son, again because of the status of his mother. Now, most major daimyo, having established who their successor would be, and as an aside, let me say that typically, if the eldest son died, if the eldest son prior to the Lord, if the eldest son died and he had a living male child, typically, not always, but typically, that child would then be named the successor. A great example would be Mori Motonari. Now his son Takamoto, his heir, predeceased him, and he had a couple of fine sons in the form of Takakage and Motoharu. But Takamoto's, at that time, child son, Teramoto, was named the heir. When Takeda Shingen forced his son Yoshinobu, his eldest son and heir Yoshinobu, to commit suicide, he named the son of the next eligible potential heir, Katsuyori, Remember, we talked about in the Takeda Shingen podcast that he had two sons in between. One of them was blind and one of them had already died. The Katsuyori's son was named as the heir, with Katsuyori, in the event of Shingen's untimely death, which was in fact to be the case, to act as a regent. But, that being said, usually younger sons were basically ideally adopted into other houses for a number of reasons. Firstly, by doing so, you accrued more power to your family by basically bringing those families under your aegis. In the case of Motonari, again, that's probably the most famous and successful example of that. By having his son Takekange adopted into the Kobayakawa family and his son Motoharu adopted into the Kikawa families, he brought both of these fairly powerful local lords under his aegis. And most families, not all, there are certainly a lot of exceptions. The Shimizu come to mind, but a lot of families would try to do this. And the other advantage of doing that is that basically it gets them out of the way. It takes them out of the line of succession, because once you were adopted into another home, generally speaking, at that point, and this harkens back to why Katsuyori, even though he was the eldest surviving eligible son of Shingen upon the death of Yoshinobu, why he was not technically named the heir was because he had already been adopted into the Suwa family. Once a son was adopted into another family, typically he was considered ineligible for succession in the main branch of the family. So in the case of the Takeda, we see that he adopted sons, Katsuyori, into the Suwa. He had a son adopted into the Nishina family, another into the Katsuriyama family, another into the Uno family, and apparently one into the Yasuda family as well. And Nobunaga himself, he sent his son Nobuo into the Kitabatake clan, Nobutaka into the Kanbei clan. Both of these were from Ise province, by the way. Hidekatsu had been adopted at a young age by Hashiba Hideyoshi. I guess when you get to the fourth son, you're just giving him away at that point. And his fifth son, Katsunaga, he gave, and that's an interesting story for another time, he gave to the Toyama family in Mino province.
All right, and that was it for this episode. So hopefully you found it interesting. Again, this is a throwback episode that I discovered. I'd totally forgotten about. I literally forgot about it for like 7 years. And, those old Chris and Forrest episodes that we used to do seem to be pretty popular. So, I thought that I would put one more out there, So, anyway, hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully you did get some useful information about the samurai and about the daimyo in there. So I guess we're about done. And again, if you're so inclined, please check out patreon.com/samuraiarchives to see how you can support the podcast. All right. Catch you next time.